Imagine sitting in a bar in Texas. You're not drinking an import. You're not drinking a hazy IPA. You're drinking a Lone Star. I'm going to get into the history of Lone Star on this episode of Beer in Front. Every beer has a story. Some changed history. Some disappeared overnight. Some changed the way we drink. If you like learning something every time you watch or listen, welcome to Beer in Front. And sometimes the beer in front of you is the best one yet. Did you know there are two Lone Star breweries worth talking about? You might only think there's one, but there's actually two. We're going to get into the history of Lone Star. On today's show, I'm going to talk to Jeremy Banas. He's the author of the new book, Lone Star Beer, The History of Two Iconic San Antonio Breweries. And since this is Beer in Front, you know I'm opening up a Lone Star to have after the show. So if you're a fan of old school classic beers, this one's right up your alley. Have a seat at the bar and join me on this week's Beer in Front as we talk all about Lone Star. There are certain beers that are almost inseparable from where they come from. Old Style has Chicago. Narragansett has New England. Yingling has Pennsylvania. And down in Texas, there's Lone Star, the beer that proudly calls itself the national beer of Texas. And while you might think of Lone Star as simply an inexpensive macro in a bottle or can with a big red star on it, there's actually quite a bit of history behind this beer. That history goes all the way back to San Antonio in the 1880s. The original Lone Star Brewery was established in 1883 with beer production beginning the following year. One of the people involved was none other than Adolphus Busch of Anheuser-Busch fame, along with a group of San Antonio businessmen. This wasn't some little operation brewing a couple barrels in the back of a saloon either. The Lone Star Brewery was one of the first large mechanized breweries in Texas. It had at the time modern brewing equipment, its own bottling operation, and the beer was shipped by wagon and railroad throughout Texas and even into California. Here's where the Lone Star story gets a little complicated. That original brewery didn't necessarily make the Lone Star beer we know today. It produced beers like Buck and Alamo. The brewery operated successfully until Prohibition shut down the Texas brewing industry in 1918. And unlike some breweries, the original Lone Star never reopened after Prohibition. But the Lone Star name wasn't dead. In 1940, another San Antonio brewery acquired the rights to the Lone Star name and began producing what would become the modern Lone Star beer. That first year, the new Lone Star Brewing Company produced about 39,000 barrels. And this is where Lone Star really started developing its identity as a Texas beer. Eventually, the brewery adopted one of the greatest beer slogans ever created, the national beer of Texas. Technically, Texas isn't the nation anymore, but don't tell Texans that. The slogan worked because Lone Star wasn't trying to be sophisticated. It wasn't trying to be an import. It was Texas. Cold beer, barbecue, honky-tonks, pickup trucks, Friday night football games, and neighborhood bars. By the 60s and 70s, Lone Star had become deeply connected with Texas music and drinking culture. The brand itself still points to that period, noting its presence at concerts and Texas bars and barbecues going back decades. And the brewery became pretty substantial. By 1981, production had reached roughly 1.5 million barrels between Lone Star Light, and Buckhorn. But like so many classic American regional breweries, ownership started changing hands. Olympia Brewing bought Lone Star in the 70s, then sold it to G. Heileman Brewing Company in 1983. Eventually, the brand ended up within the collection of brands controlled by Pabst, and the old San Antonio brewing era eventually came to an end. In 2001, the Pearl Brewery in San Antonio, where Lone Star was being produced, closed, and production of Lone Star was contracted elsewhere. So today's Lone Star isn't quite the hometown San Antonio brewing operation it once was, but here's the interesting part. The identity survived. Lone Star is still marketed around Texas culture. The Red Star is still there. The slogan is still there. And the company still traces the brand's heritage back to 1884. As for the beer itself, Lone Star Original is exactly the kind of beer you'd expect from an old school American regional lager. It's light, it's crisp, it's straightforward. There's some malt character, a little sweetness, little restrained bitterness, and a nice clean finish. You're not supposed to sit there for 15 minutes trying to identify tasting notes. You're supposed to drink it cold, and preferably somewhere in Texas. That's really why I think Lone Star is interesting. There are objectively more flavorful beers. There are certainly more complicated beers. But beer isn't always about complexity. Sometimes beer is about the place. It's why old style tastes a little bit better in a Chicago tavern. It's why Narragansett somehow makes more sense in Rhode Island. And it's why Lone Star feels right sitting on the bar of a Texas honky tonk. For more than 140 years, the Lone Star name has been connected with Texas beers. Breweries have opened and closed, ownership has changed, production has moved, beer trends have come and gone, but that big red star has stuck around, and sometimes that's enough. Lone Star, nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just a cold American lager with a hell of a lot of Texas history behind it. And that's exactly the kind of beer that I like here on Beer in Front, because sometimes the best beer is the one that's sitting in front of you. All right, welcome back. Every Texan knows the can with the star on it. What most of them don't know is that Lone Star beer is actually the story of two entirely different breweries wearing the same name. Jeremy Banas has spent nearly 20 years writing about beer in his own books on Pearl and San Antonio's brewing history. His latest, Lone Star Beer, A History of Two Iconic San Antonio Breweries, untangles how a Busch-backed 1880s brewery that never made a drop of Lone Star gave way decades later after Prohibition and a brewery relocation out of Pancho Villa era Mexico to the beer that became shorthand for Texas itself. Jeremy, thanks. Welcome back.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a minute since the book on Celis came out.
Oh gosh, yeah, 5 years.
Yeah,
Little over
it's
5
been a
years.
long time, long overdue.
Mm-hmm.
Well, most people think Lone Star has this one long continuous history. When did you realize you were telling two different stories?
It was something that I was aware of when doing the first book on San Antonio brewing history. The chapter that was about Lone Star discussed the two different Lone Stars. So in some ways, this book was born from that, the way the Pearl book was born from the two chapters in the first book as well. Just two big stories that needed more space than a couple of chapters. So fast forward to 2 years ago, and it's ready now to sit down and do Lone Star, but actually untangle for everybody else. And and granted, the vast majority of folks think it's one big brewery, and I can see why. Going back to 1884, but there were, there's still collectors, beer memorabilia collectors, and so forth, who always knew two different breweries, and not even business related in any regard whatsoever. But with the vast majority of folks, and perhaps with some unintentional, for sure, confusing advertising on the cans a few years ago, it needed to be untangled and it needed to be put down all in one place where it was accessible to everybody. Finally get the story right, all in one place, so without everybody having to go to 20,000 resources and essentially do the research
Yeah.
I did, um, to untangle that, and how many people are gonna really take the time for that. So it's all in one place, it's preserved going forward.
Excellent. Walk me through the moment that the first Lone Star Brewing Company, the one that's now the San Antonio Museum of Art, how did they lose their name and shut down? What killed it?
Prohibition and a lack of interest in continuing it by Adolphus Busch.
Okay.
So you have Adolphus Busch backing some local San Antonio businessmen, one of whom really had a brewery still at that time. It closed and became a part of Lone Star Brewing Association pretty quickly after Lone Star was formed. But Adolphus Busch was not the 100% owner. Again, business partners, but it was his money that coupled with theirs and his experience already with Anheuser-Busch that really helped kick this thing off the ground in a way that few people still are able to do today. But they acquire Alamo Brewing. They acquire a couple of other smaller ones, and then they brew those brands. They were brewing under their own moniker, a Bock, a Porter, other things, not just a German or European lager, and not just an adjunct lager. They were brewing all kinds of things. Very successful. The original wooden buildings quickly gave way to brick buildings to replace them, turning into the overall facility that the San Antonio Museum of Art housed. Stable for the horses. They had a well on site. They had their own small little volunteer fire department. I mean, the whole ball of wax, much the same as San Antonio Brewing Association or Pearl. Kept expanding. Fast forward into the 20th century, we've got rumblings of Prohibition in the early 1900s. Granted, in Europe, it started a little sooner, but you start getting near when Prohibition goes into effect, and they decide to do much like Pearl did, change their business model. Had to really change their business model, change their focus, add other things like making ice, making a soda. They made a soda as well. And then again, near beer was allowed by law, but that was well under 2%. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact number, but so they go into doing that. Well, it lasts a year into Prohibition, and I mean, the brewery's not exactly going under per se monetarily, but it's struggling much the way everybody else was struggling that was trying to stay open, Pearl included. And Adolphus Busch just finally said, "You know what? It's just not worth it," because
Yeah.
he had started Galveston Brewing in Galveston, Texas, as well, after Lone Star, and just this isn't worth. I've got other things going on,
Yeah.
whereas Pearl had just Pearl going on, right, or San Antonio Brewing. So that's how that one ended. So you have that copyright, that name that's hanging out there. He still owns it, but at some point during Prohibition, it falls, vacant or outside of him having any control with it, and he wasn't going to do anything with it. So the local San Antonian had obtained the copyright, and he was planning on reopening a Lone Star Brewing Association, possibly at the original site, but never did anything with it. Never used it. Got the copyright and just never did anything with it. So it's over 5 years that he has it, and the Lone Star 2.0, as I like to call it, basically second Lone Star, who it was already in San Antonio under the Sabinas Brewing name, and that's where you alluded earlier. They moved up from Mexico. Still had one brewery in Mexico, but we're closing down the one in Sabinas, Mexico. Moved it up here. It became Sabinas San Antonio, but a couple ownership changes. And in 1940, they finagle their ownership of the name Lone Star Beer, Lone Star Brewing, Lone Star Brewing Association, and essentially just since they didn't hear anything from the guy that actually had it and he hadn't been using it, they didn't. At that point, they stopped trying the legal route and they just rebranded.
Took it for themselves. Yeah.
Basically just took it. Nobody officially given them permission per se, and it was never questioned. And that's where you get then 1940, suddenly it's Lone Star Beer, new recipe over what Sabinas had been doing before, all that.
Well, how did Adolphus Busch get involved in the area to begin with? Because I always associated him, obviously, with St. Louis.
He wanted to expand.
Okay.
He was looking at different areas in Texas, and like I said, eventually Galveston as well.
So the move from Sabinas, what did that look like actually on the ground? That has to be a huge process. I mean, how far of a distance is Sabinas to San Antonio?
Well, I mean, in today, and I'd I'd have to check the maps, but I mean, we're talking right now. I mean, it's a good, if you drove straight from San Antonio to the border, it's a good 6 hours,
All right.
and then into the area where Sabinas is, you're talking several more hours. So back in that day,
Yeah.
week, if you're lucky. So gentleman decides to open a brewery in Mexico, kind of shifting ahead a little bit. He had owned, Carl Hagelin had owned a brewery in Atchison, Kansas. Had worked for his father, and then him and his father had worked for another brewer in Kansas. He has a chance meeting with one Otto Kaler, who was one of the founders and then later the majority owner of Pearl San Antonio Brewing Association. And Otto Kaler tells him, hey, there is some great opportunities in Mexico for Americans looking to open a business, like today's equivalent of tax breaks and
Okay.
so forth. And again, this is just on the cusp of the Mexican Revolution at that time. And he decides, well, you know what? Why not? He moves down to Sabinas, starts slowly, buys some land, starts building a house, then builds what ends up becoming the brew house and a couple associated buildings, has livestock on the property. He's figuring out how to handle refrigeration for the beer to keep being able to transport it around, limited around Mexico. So he figures out refrigeration trucks and is able to do that. But he's building all of that there. Yes, a little bit of an encounter with Pancho Villa, but that's like about 10 years or so after, 10 or more years after he had opened up Sabinas. And then at that point in time, he had wanted to come back to actually had wanted to come to San Antonio. And after the Pancho Villa thing was over, he decided it was the right time to move.
Harry Jurczyk took a rebranded post-prohibition beer and somehow turned it into the national beer of Texas. Was there an actual playbook involved in this, or was that just organic over the years?
Organic over the decades.
Yeah.
Because the whole national beer of Texas thing didn't even come about until the 70s.
Okay.
The image we have of Lone Star now that everybody has, let alone everybody in Texas, this image of, as you put it before, Lone Star being synonymous with Texas itself, it's the Lone Star state. I mean, it was branding you can't make up. So when they are able to finagle that copyright, there's some new ownership and the brewery rebrands as Lone Star. I mean, that was just easy money, even in the beginning, because within the first few years, they started expanding. Jurczyk is a part owner, very much a minority owner at that point. He's not quite on the board, but he's in charge of all, essentially advertising and sales. He came from a sales background before that, working for Judson Candies in San Antonio, who, oddly enough, fast forward quite a few decades, Pearl Brewing bought Judson Candies and ran it for a while. So two of them going back and forth as beer rivals. Pearl ends up owning a place Harry Jurczyk originally started out as.
Okay.
But he works in, I mean, the man was a consummate salesman. He knew how to market this. He knew what Texas wanted. He was able to get everyone convinced, even if it was never overall over the decades, outselling Pearl. There were periods where it did. But overall, you look at the time period that they were open and that section of Pearl's history, Pearl far outsold them, but the rivalry was there nonetheless. It's much like the Packers and the Bears.
Yeah.
Over the years. Packers have had a little more success overall, but the Bears are always there.
Yep.
Um,
Well, at least last year. We'll see.
Well,
We'll see what happens.
At least last year. And,
Yeah.
and if I recall, there was this whole refrigerator Perry thing in the 80s. But at any rate, it's kind of similar to that, I guess. So he takes this, it starts growing, they're expanding within the first few years. After 10 years, they've already on their third or fourth expansion, and they're adding on to the original building that Sabinas built in 33 when they came up from Mexico. And by the way, with Sabinas, they brought the equipment from their brewery in Sabinas and had it carted up to San Antonio, literally carted.
You were talking about Harry Jersig's marketing, but I associate Lone Star with like music. I think of people like Willie Nelson, other Texas artists. I think of like music as a big part, or that's just my impression from up north.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're not wrong. And that's kind of what I alluded to a minute ago.
Mhm.
The impression we have of Lone Star, whether throughout the country or let alone in Texas, all of that image originated in the 70s
Mhm.
with a switch in their advertising campaign, mainly for the Austin area. It spilled into San Antonio and the rest of Texas. But remember, Austin was where Willie and Gary P. Nunn and all of those guys were playing specifically at a place called Armadillo World Headquarters. One of, yeah, I mean, if you're going to talk great music venues, even though it closed in, I think, 81, it was open around a little over 10 years or about 10 years. It was the GOAT of
Mhm.
venues of that kind at that time, and really even today. And yes, half of anybody in Austin that's been around for a while, it was Armadillo World Headquarters, but it was kind of in conjunction with them and one of their regional sales guys, Jerry Retzloff, who decided, hey, you know what? Every time I go into this Armadillo World Headquarters and other bars in Austin, I'm seeing a crap load of Lone Star being consumed. I mean, outside of I think the Astrodome in Houston, well, it's no longer there, but the Armadillo World Headquarters had the second most amount of Lone Star sold after the Astrodome.
Okay.
That's impressive for a small music venue compared to a sports stadium.
Yeah, that's
And so he started going, you know what? Why the hell aren't we capitalizing? All these guys, they were calling it cosmic country. You start hearing the term outlaw country,
Mhm.
you know, evolving. Why are we not capitalizing on this connection? Well, a guy named Barry Sullivan, who came from Narragansett Brewing in the Northeast, who's been back around now for a little while, did a similar thing with Narragansett in the Northeast. So he encounters Jerry Retzloff when he gets hired at Lone Star. Well, brief stint at Falstaff in between, but Jerry's got this idea and he's like, hey, great. I did that as well. Let's run with it. And Jersig was like, not happy with the idea. He was straight and narrow, leave it to Beaver kind of guy. He decided, well, as long as the beer's selling and the money's coming in, what I don't know, I'm not gonna screw with it. We'll try this out. But as much as Jersig and Retzloff were friends, and Retzloff's father used to rent boats to Harry Jersig back in the day, so he knew the kid and had kind of mentored him, helped him pay for his college degree and everything. But he did tell him, "You guys are going to go down this route. It doesn't work. You may not have a job anymore because business is business."
yeah.
Fortunately, it worked, and so they partnered with Armadillo World Headquarters and a guy there, and started coming up with the Armadillo advertising with Lone Star. And the gentleman that did all of that was already a known. There's Austin's often been referred to, at least since the 70s, as kind of an unofficial city moniker of keep Austin weird,
Weird. Yeah.
because Austin was this kind of, Boulder, Colorado, California kind of vibe. This whole keep Austin weird thing. Well, that was definitely started with Armadillo World Headquarters. And he was already a known artist. He was already doing some of the armadillo art and so forth. And so he actually, with Jerry Retzloff, kind of said, kicking it around in the parking lot of the venue, and they're just talking about, these bottles we have, these elongated necks, they're long necks. That's sort of kind of how that came about. Retzloff had also heard some spring breakers that were from what is now Texas State University
Mhm.
in San Marcos, but they're on spring break and they're finding out who he works for, and they're like, "Oh, we love those long necks, those Lone Star long necks," and he's like, "What the hell?" So him and Franklin, who's the artist, and the guy at Armadillo World Headquarters kicking it around, is like, let's use that too. So you start seeing the tie-in with Willie Nelson, with Gary P. Nunn again, and all of those guys. And what they're doing is they're not even paying them to help advertise. Retzloff had the idea, let's do this low key because we don't want any of these guys necessarily to be seen as having sold out. They're kind of on the edge of
Hmm.
alt society kind of. They're rebels, right? They're going the outlaw route with their music and their attitude and everything else. So it's like, all right, they're already kind of drinking this stuff on stage, and everybody else watching them is drinking this stuff. They made sure that Willie Nelson specifically, who was absolutely huge for them, that he always had free Lone Star to drink. They just gave him at the venue Lone Star. Always made sure his tour bus was stocked with plenty of Lone Star.
Amongst
Willie
other
would come
things.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Willie would come down
Yeah.
and with his band and do a small version of a concert at board meeting
Wow.
quite a few times. But just having all these musicians, and it was mainly those cosmic outlaw country musicians, but the venue had acts of all genres playing there. You have these musicians up on stage, and they're holding Lone Star. You don't even have to have a radio ad, print ad, TV commercial, nothing. And they're going to go, oh, I love Willie Nelson. I need to be drinking Lone Star.
Hmm.
And then you have this whole kind of capitalizing on Texas as an image, even if half of everybody drinking Lone Star at that point was shifting away from the ranchers and the farmers to the much younger crowd. That was what they were trying again to capture. So for that 10 years, the 70s into the very early 80s, most of the Lone Star sold in Texas was coming out of Austin, which was kind of some competition for Shiner Bock. But all of that, the image we have now, even though there were many other ad campaigns, many other images before the 70s, the lasting image of the second Lone Star's entire legacy is that period of the 1970s and that ad campaign, and that has continued to this day. So I tried focusing on that from Jerry Retzloff and Barry Sullivan's perspectives when covering the 70s, because the two of them were Lone Star's history in the 70s.
I mean, there's no Lone Star neon signs in every bar here. I just think of it from back in the day, seeing pictures of Willie Nelson, on stage somewhere with a Lone Star, maybe on the speaker in his hand.
No, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. And it
Yeah.
worked.
Yeah.
They outside of donating the beer, which was much cheaper than any advertising they could come up with, and paying those guys to do
Yeah.
commercials and stuff. Now, eventually they did have radio commercials where a jingle was written and Willie would sing it. And again, I keep mentioning Gary P. Nunn,
Yeah.
and a lot of those guys would start volunteering
Mhm.
to do their version of that same song on the radio. But that developed after this literal grassroots advertising. And I mean, it's cheaper donating the beer
Yeah.
than it is paying for a giant campaign.
Oh,
So the
yeah.
campaign was very low key until it wasn't.
Yeah. Especially, late 70s, early 80s. That was like, I mean, Willie's had more heydays than all of us put together, but, that was on the road again time and everything else. So Willie was at the top of his game at that point, too. So hiring somebody like that to do a jingle would have cost, your left arm.
Oh, 100%.
Well, you've said that beer can tell the story of a place and a people. What does Lone Star tell us about Texas that Texas wouldn't say itself?
That everybody rides a horse and wears a cowboy hat
All right.
and has a Lone Star in their hand, and somewhere there's an armadillo in the picture.
All right.
I mean, Pabst, who owns the brand now and has owned it since '98, they're happy to capitalize on all of that, and why shouldn't they? It's part of their legacy owning that brand, but they're not going to come right out and say, at least I can't speak for them. So if anybody from Lone Star eventually hears this, I apologize. I don't think they would say, yes, Lone Star defines what it means to be Texas, and we all ride horses and wear hats and have a lasso and a gun on our hip. But again, you think Lone Star beer, the first thing you think of is that image of Texas.
Yeah.
Oh, and then Willie Nelson's in the back serenading everybody. So
All right, let me get you out of here with some quick rapid fire ones. And it's kind of odd because you're drinking out of a glass and I'm drinking it out of the bottle. But on a normal night, Lone Star, straight out of the bottle or poured into a pint glass?
Well, back in the day, straight out of the bottle.
Very good. One word that Texans use to describe Lone Star that outsiders wouldn't get.
Well, I'm going to go with armadillos.
All right. What's the worst myth you've had to debunk while researching the book?
Well, kind of the very purpose of the book.
Mhm.
That Lone Star started in 1884 and is still around now, and that they've got an over 140-year history. They don't.
And finally, if you had to describe Lone Star's whole history with one sentence for someone who's never heard of it, what's the sentence?
Lone Star beer is going places.
Very good. Well, Jeremy, where can people find the book?
Online, it's in a lot of brick and mortar bookshops in Texas, Austin, San Antonio, and so forth, around Texas and a little bit around the country. But online, Amazon, of course, Barnes and Noble online sells it. Books a Million, if anybody's familiar with them. And actually, if you look at a lot of bookstores, they may not have it in stock, but you can order it online and get it sent to you. So, or the publisher's website, Arcadia Publishing.
I'll put all those links in the show note, but it's an excellent book. I'm reading it right now. Once again, the book is called Lone Star Beer, A History of Two Iconic San Antonio Breweries. Jeremy, I appreciate so much for taking time out again tonight.
No, thank you,
Talk
Dave.
about this. I can't wait. We got to make this a lot faster than every 5 years to talk.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Thanks again, Jeremy. Talk to you later, sir.
You bet.
All right. Well, I can't do an episode on Lone Star without having one here. So I'm going to crack open the Lone Star. Now, this is 4.7% alcohol, 140 calories, 12 carbs. They use malted barley and corn extract in this. They use, according to their website, the choicest hops. So let's crack open the Lone Star. It's a twist off, so you're not going to get an opening sound out of this. Lone Star is a beautiful, nice, light color, good. Couple fingers of eggshell white foam. Smells great. It just smells like your classic beer. Can't go wrong with that. The aroma's fantastic. Solid beer. Definitely crushable. I get some of the corn, you get the barley. You don't get a lot of hops. It's not an IPA. It's not a hop bomb here, but definitely you get the hop flavor out of this. Just a solid crushable beer. You can knock these off all day. No, and it's really good. Now, I picked this up here in Chicago at my Binny's. You don't see it a lot in Chicago, obviously. We're not in Texas, but Binny's Beverage Depot does carry it. On their website, if you go to LoneStarBeer.com, they have a find beer section. So if you're looking for it near you, you could hit that up. But excellent beer. I mean, just it's a great macro beer. You could kill this all day, every day. So if you see Lone Star Beer, you know what to do. You got to put it in the cart. Dead Guy Ale and Rogue might live on. About 9 months after Rogue Ale and Spirits filed for Chapter 7, there's companies out there that are trying to get the intellectual property. As of now that I'm recording this on Friday the 14th, there's a company in the UK called Silver Scope Media. They put out a $400,000 bid, and the bankruptcy court and the District of Oregon, they're accepting offers through the 21st. So if anyone else wants it, you need to come up with a little bit more than $400,000. But it's quite possible that if this company wins or someone else, that you could be seeing Dead Guy Ale and other great beers from Rogue back on shelves soon. The hearing for this is going to take place on August 26th. But if they win, or whoever wins, they're going to get Rogue's assets, including the website, any recipes, information, manufacturing, yeast strains, all of that, and trademarks, including the famed Dead Guy Ale. So don't be surprised if you see the new Dead Guy Ale on your shelves coming up sometime next year. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Beer in Front. I want to thank once again Jeremy Banas, author of Lone Star Beer, A History of Two Iconic San Antonio Breweries. I'll include the links in the show notes where you could pick this book up for yourself. Definitely it's a winner. Put it in the cart. Please, if you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/beerinfront. Have a great week, everyone. I'll see you next week. And next week, we're going to get into how to take better photographs of your beer. Have a great week. I'll see you next week. And remember, sometimes the beer in front of you is the best one yet.